Plus with Warren Buffett, who's the chairman and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. Right now, we're joined by Charlie Munger, who's the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway.
स्टॉक मार्केट रिलेटेड इंटरव्यू वीडियो पाने के लिए मेरे चैनल को सब्सक्राइब करें और बेल आइकन को दबा दें।
You heard at the top all of this concern about China. This is spooking the markets a little bit today. Joe's right. It's a decline of under 2% for the Dow, but still down 460 points is a number that catches your attention. And when you look at China's markets, down 5.5% and down 7%. That is certainly something that is catching their attention today, too. I can't think of three better people to talk about this morning. Bill, you've spent so much time going back and forth with China. You know the Chinese leadership very well and can understand maybe what they're thinking on some of these things. Charlie, you've spent so much time getting excited about investing there. And Bill, you've invested there as well. Warren, same thing. All three of you have traveled there and spent this time. I just wonder what you're thinking about this morning as you hear these headlines. And Bill, you're the new one at the table today, so I'll ask you to start off with this. What are your thoughts on what you hear with this tweet and the potential for a real trade war?
Well, I think good trade relations are an incredible win-win for both countries. And it's dangerous if people think this is a zero-sum game. And so I'm hopeful that despite the latest announcement, there is a trade agreement and the two countries can find ways to work together. It's the most important relationship in the world. Both sides bring a lot of strengths. So I understand why markets are a little bit worried that these tariffs are going to get higher and higher.
When we first got the tweet, there had been some initial reports that Li Hu and the delegation from China might not be coming here. That's what we were hearing last night. This is the first I've heard just a moment ago that the Chinese have confirmed that they will be sending that delegation this week. That in itself is good news. But how do the Chinese kind of deal with this when they're faced with real force, like I think that tweet yesterday was?
Well, I'm not an expert on negotiation, but it creates a dynamic where both sides could start escalating against each other, which would be a lose for both sides. So, this week it'll be interesting. Even though China's not a democracy, the political dynamics don't allow them to look like they're caving in to a unilateral position.
And Charlie, you are an expert in negotiation. What do you think?
Well, hardly, but, if you go back, we put a tariff on trucks to prevent the Japanese from totally squelching the whole American auto industry. And that lasted a long time. It wasn't the end of the world. So if we end up with some trade settlement that involves some tariffs on both sides, I don't get excited about it at all. I regard it as part of normal life. Generally speaking, I think a good settlement is better than a lovely world war.
Some tariffs are one thing. 10%, we seem like our economy has gone along just fine, even with the 10% tariff that existed on those $200 billion to date. Is 25% tariffs on potentially all 500 billion plus of the imports coming in. Would that concern you about the American economy?
Well, I don't think we want a full-scale tariff war that's just as high as both sides can make it. That would be massively stupid. And if both of them are a little disappointed with the negotiations and feel a little roughed up, that's what they should feel.
What do you mean they should feel roughed up?
Well, both sides, since a settlement is so much better than a trade war for both sides, they ought to just get used to having a little loss of face and make some kind of a settlement. And I think they will.
What do you think about us taking a stance, us being America, taking a stance with China to this point?
Well, I don't think Trump is totally crazy to say that on some occasions you put a tariff on to save some domestic industry.
Is he right that we have been on the losing side of the deal for some time? There's a lot of Americans who feel that.
I think he thinks of it more as a loss if we've got a trade deficit. And I don't think that's at all automatic. So I don't totally agree with him, but I agree with Trump in part.
Warren, what do you think in terms of who pays the tariffs? I mean, it has boosted the U.S. Treasury, but a lot of those tariffs are being paid by the companies that import the goods and then passed on to consumers.
Yeah, they're a tax on consumers, and you know, as such, that it changes what people buy. It changes where things are produced. I mean, you can readjust the world through tariffs, and generally speaking, I mean, there's obvious exceptions for key equipment, military equipment, or but I generally think that a world that adjusts to something very close to free trade, more people will live better than in a world with significant tariffs and shifting tariffs over time. I mean, it was a subject of constant negotiation and that sort of thing.
Probably a less chance in war, too, if there's heavy trade on both sides.
Yeah.
Not a trade war. You mean a real
Yeah,
war?
real war, yes.
Because
But you got to remember that our country, the United States, ran on tariffs for the first 150 years. That was all the revenue we had. This is not like some novel new thing is coming in. This is an old subject.
is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, of course, I'd rather have total goodwill and everybody getting along. But I don't think it's the end of the world. There's some little tension on the subject. There has been since the start of the country.
Bill just now said he's not surprised by the market's reaction. Warren said the same thing earlier this morning. What about you?
Well, what do I care about a brief, temporary reaction over some uproar over trade negotiations?
Does that mean...
There are all so many little ripples in space-time to me.
Look, if you look at Chinese stocks in one market down 5.5%, and the other in the Shenzhen market down by over 7%, our futures are down, but that's still a decline of less than 2% this morning. Does that mean it's more painful to China than to us?
Well, I don't think China likes its market going down as a consequence of a trade uproar. I think the people are more like this, settle a thing because they had this uproar today.
Settling sounds like a great alternative, but
It certainly does.
There have been a lot of friction along the way. The biggest one may be just how do you enforce it, and the feeling, at least among many of the trade negotiators in the United States, that when we've cut deals with China in the past, they say things and then don't follow through on it. How do you make sure that if we have a deal, it's actually enforceable?
I think China, by and large, is a pretty good place. It certainly worked well for the Chinese, and I think it's desirable that it works well.
We want China to prosper.
Yeah, we do.
If you postulate a world where in the next 50 years, the China, or for that matter, the United States, but feel like they're being abused and the word isn't being kept, and you ask for one thing and then you want to ask for one thing more. I mean, you're going to always have tension between the two countries. You'll always have disagreements, but you can't really turn it where it gets into something where it gets out of control, and things can't get out of control.
But I guess I'm going back to try and figure out which side you think is right. Nobody wants to say that. Does anybody have a feeling?
Well, I think they're both right to be as concerned as they are, and I predict they'll settle it.
Would you all agree with that same prediction? Bill, what do you think?
It's a dilemma when it appears you're reacting to an ultimatum. In the Chinese case, there's no elections scheduled, so their leader won't be unelected simply because they've had to take a tough stance on trade negotiations. Markets up until recently were assuming this deal would get closed.
Right.
So that's a little bit why you see the delta. The rational thing would be for a deal to get closed, and I'd still rate that as likely.
I agree with Bill.
Deadlines are tricky things, though. I mean,
Yeah.
they produce reactions in people, and they can, particularly if you're responding to public opinion, they can inflame people, and then they start reacting to their own. They're tricky things. On the other hand, sometimes it's the best way to get things done.
A good sign, though, maybe that they just said that the Chinese delegation will continue to come, because I had real questions about that, or doubts about that myself, after seeing that yesterday.
You want to conduct a negotiation so it doesn't look like the other guy has to cave or something like
Right.
that. The ideal thing is to make a hero out of him and still get the deal you want.
Over the weekend at the annual meeting, you two had an aside on stage that a lot of people kind of picked up on. You didn't follow up on it, so I thought we could do that here. You were talking about Dairy Queen and how your presence in China is not large, but you do have a presence in China.
Yeah, we're all over China.
For Dairy Queen, it is a very large presence, but not for Berkshire Hathaway.
No.
But you made the comment, Warren, that you would have been a much larger presence had a big deal gone through. You made it in as a aside to Charlie, but
Yeah.
it was over the mics.
Well, we've looked at bigger. It didn't have anything to do with Dairy Queen. Though.
No. I figured not.
We are not turning Dairy Queen into some global giant, or yeah. We've looked at good-sized things in China, and we've done a couple things in China, and Charlie's done more individually, and it's logical. I mean, with the kind of capital we have, the big markets outside the United States are going to be the place where you're most likely to do something, and certainly China's going to be the biggest market and outside the United States, and there should be opportunities there. And I think we are someone at Berkshire, I think that if they're looking for capital around the world, we're a very logical prospect.
Why did that deal not work out? Was it because of the trade tensions?
I can't go into any details on that.
Thought I'd try.
You'll be the first to know.
In terms of what you do with your businesses, do these trade talks have any impact on you, on your investments, even your own personal ones, because you all have a large individual portfolio that you do. And Charlie, I know you focus a lot.
Some are larger than others.
Well, Charlie, I know you focused a lot on China. Does this diminish your enthusiasm for Chinese investments in any way?
No.
No, it doesn't really. If we got a call today from some business we understood and liked from China, and they were looking for a lot of, it was big, we would be delighted to get that call, and we would follow through and we'd see whether something happened. But that would be very interesting to us.
Bill, how about you?
Well, certainly, there is, in parallel with the trade talks about what the technology export regime will look like in terms of things like artificial intelligence.
Right.
And so I have some concerns about whether that will try and partition, Chinese students from American students. The general sentiment towards China right now has gone down a bit. And so there are businesses or business deals that have to go through a new process, and they're talking about even making that tighter.
CFIUS or beyond?
So I'm worried about even the sort of intellectual cooperation being slowed down. We'll see where that goes, but it's a concern.
If they take our intellectual property at Dairy Queen, though, we can handle it.
We've talked an awful lot on our air recently about socialism versus capitalism, defending capitalism, all of the different political pressures that are kind of being brought as we get into another election year. And I thought maybe we could talk about that this morning, too. Over the weekend, several questions came up about defending capitalism. And Warren, you did step out and say that you're a card-carrying member, a card-carrying capitalist in front of everyone. What do you think about the attacks that we've seen to this point on capitalism?
Well, I think don't think people exactly even know what they're talking about. It isn't that capitalism is perfect, but if you look at what was here in 1776 and look at what is here now, this country has done an incredible job in terms of the deployment of resources and human ingenuity. And that is a product of the system. Now, does that mean that every decision should be made simply by open market determinants? No, there's a need for regulation, obviously, and there are things that have long-term costs and might not get built in. But the idea of people unleashing their potential, using the resources they have to create what we have now from what was here 240-some years ago, it's absolutely a miracle, and what all three of us have seen during our lifetime. And if you compare that with any centralized planned economy, I think we win hands down. And I think we've just started with what capitalism can produce in the United States. But I do think it obviously it needs certain rules and regulations.
Bill, you did an interview in Davos with someone, and you made a pretty innocuous statement that you looked around, you thought capitalism was the best system, and you got attacked online from all these people who came up with these crazy statements about how could you say things like that. I mean, what do you think about the climate when you see things like that?
Well, some people think when you defend capitalism, you're defending the tax rates we have today and saying that higher absolute tax rates or more progressive tax rates, that you're disagreeing with them. And I don't think Warren and I are disagreeing that you could make the taxes more progressive. In fact, we've been very explicit in some areas, like the estate tax, and saying we think that would be a good thing. Socialism...
You got your wish, it came back.
Socialism used to mean that the state controlled the means of production. And a lot of people who are promoting socialism actually aren't using that classic definition. So what we're going to have is capitalism with some level of taxation. Most people really aren't arguing against capitalism. There may be a few, but most people are just saying that the taxes should change.
Although you do have someone who I think is polling the second highest in the Democratic Party right now, who was a socialist until very recently, Bernie Sanders.
Well, whether or not he was a socialist by the full term of that, now there is some muddy areas. When you start to say there shouldn't be any billionaires, that you have some cap on wealth or something like that, that goes beyond what I think, and you could say I'm self-interested, but...
Really?
We will exempt the present ones. No, but government needs to reallocate some resources. I mean, extreme case would be in World War II. I mean, that's the closest we've come to socialism. You had an Office of Price Administration. You had a War Production Board. But during peacetime, you're always prepared for war, and you do that through government. Government needs to reallocate some resources. But the market system, which exists under capitalism, is an extraordinarily effective way, and has proven it, of using resources, human and other kinds, to produce incredible goods. And Henry Ford could devise a system that could turn out a couple million cars a year, but he could only use half a dozen himself, or his whole family could use 50. I mean, he had to turn out a couple million cars that other people got to use, and that would not have, in my view, I think if you'd set up a government bureau in 1850 and given them 100 years to develop a car, I'm not so sure that you'd have ever come up with anything like the assembly lines of Ford and all of the things that have happened. Human ingenuity is incredible, and you want something that maximizes its use and then curbs a few of the ideas that some of those people may have to sort of have it fall for themselves.
Charlie, you've made the same point.
The great proof of how capitalism works is China. When China copied Singapore and let the farmers own their own plots and let the manufacturers own their own businesses and so forth, China's productivity increased many times. And they went from rural poverty to modern extreme wealth. And they did it by adopting a fair amount of capitalism. Now, if a Democratic politician doesn't understand that, he's nuts.
You've made the same point, though, Charlie, that you think private sector does it much better than the government sector. However, a lot of these people who are running also want to make government much bigger.